So the next speaker of the day is Mr. Debashis Banerjee, who is a senior manager at Yahoo India. Debashis is a technology professional with more than 13 years of expertise in leading global teams in the development of cloud, security, internet-based and telecom products. He specializes in the areas of mobile web development, internet domain, cloud computing, security, single sign-on, privileged user management, career switching, ISDN protocol, and network management. And the topic is the cloud is as secure as you are. So if you want your cloud to be secured, please join me in welcoming Debashis Banerjee.
Hello. Good afternoon. So we're going to begin with a question I know each one of you can answer. So how many of you have children or have a child at home whom you're really fond of? Let's see a quick show of hands. Some of you don't have children at home you're fond of? Okay. So imagine this child. He goes to school. You send him off happily. Doesn't come home. How do you feel? Very often, when people start thinking of moving to the cloud, the first reaction is exactly how you would have felt when you wanted to send your child to school. And that's precisely what we're going to be talking about. Those are 4 pictures that are reasonably close to my heart. The first one is that of my son. He's about 4 years old and recently had his first day of school. So that's him holding the bag. And when I sent him to school, some of the questions that I asked were, is there a video recording that I could access of who goes in and who goes out? How do I know where the security guard is standing? What happens if there are 2 children and they start beating up each other? Does the teacher have Montessori training? Well, what am I really asking? I am fundamentally just asking about perimeter security when I talk of the security guard. I am just asking about logging and auditing when I talk about video. I am fundamentally asking about standards when I'm talking about the teacher's qualification. That's what we're talking about. Let's look at another picture. Oh, and when the 2 children fight, that is multi-tenancy. The next picture. That is a restaurant in Madhivala where we once had our anniversary party. And for the men in your room, if you mess up your anniversary party, what happens? Well, I can at least hear a few laughs. There's a lady smiling here. Looks like her husband. Well, anyway. So that was on the party. We had about 15 guests. And of those 15 guests, I asked the person in the restaurant, what happens if one of them brings their cousins along? If there are 20, he said it's okay. The other question, there's a party going on next door. How do I know they're not going to walk in? And the food gets mixed. Well, we're vegetarians. And he said, that's okay, we'll post somebody in there. Fundamentally, again, what we're talking about is elasticity, on-demand service, and essentially, if you're in a cloud infrastructure, are you going to talk about commingling of VMs, data, isolation? The third picture, that's a picture of, I don't get bumped up to business class very often. I'm not that lucky, but I did a couple of times. So that's a picture of me in the airplane, one of my trips. A couple of questions in there. What happens if this flight is delayed? What are you going to do if it crashes? Again, BCP, disaster recovery is the questions that you're talking about. And finally, the bank. We heard somebody talk about just before this that if you're in a bank scenario and you're mostly using private clouds and your money, we trust banks, right? We put our money in there. We don't go ahead digging holes in the ground and burying our money in there and feeling good about it. So again, here's a good example of a service that you trust. So if you look at these 4 examples, that is precisely the session that we're going to talk about, which is that cloud can be as secure as you want it to be, because each of you already have the life skills that are required for you to judge when a cloud should be secure. We're going to learn a little bit more about the how part, of course. We'll look at a small network of how the cloud can be made secure across private, public, and hybrid clouds. Ask a few questions. Look a little bit into the mobile space. We're talking of the multi-screen experiences right across. And finally, look at two-factor authentication. Example, if you've gone to one of the booths outside, they talk about precisely that, the OTPs and SMS. So a couple of key questions that you ask about cloud security. What do you want to protect, and who are your users? Okay, how many of us here think that our birthday, the date which we are born in, is a privileged confidential information, or is it privileged confidential information? Okay, some of you don't. Please do not post it on your public sites. It is privileged confidential information. It is one of the most protected pieces of data on the internet very often. And if you talk to somebody who works in one of these companies, they'll tell you that. We don't think of it like that very often. What are you protecting? Are you protecting your birthday pictures? Are you protecting privileged confidential information? Who are your users? There was once a conference I was speaking at, and there was this person who came from a government bank. And he said, I have these people in rural areas who come up to me with the phone and with the OTP here and show me with the number they've received as the PIN and say, can you tell me what's happening here? What's going on here? So here's an example of what type of users that you're going to talk about. We had Sandeep talk a little bit while back about how in a rural infrastructure, it's possible that a cloud might be more efficient. But here are some examples where possibly the other way around. You probably shouldn't be using two-factor authentication when you've got some stuff on the cloud. You probably shouldn't be using some of the technologies which you would otherwise use in different environments. That's another thing to look at. Where does your data live? Is your data living on file servers? Is your data living on some third-party stacks? Is your data, in some cases, we heard about the BYOD a short while back. All our phones these days have, for example, your Android's got an SQLite DB which can store certain data. All our phones have local DBs which are in there. How much of your data is probably living in there? Because your device is now simply an extension of your cloud, because you're going to be connecting to enterprise and non-enterprise applications. Where's your data living? How does it flow? What kind of things? We saw a few examples of how it flows in a few of the earlier presentations across from outside the cloud, into the cloud, into the cloud, into the storage, into the storage, into the DB. There's backup. And sometimes they might even be backed up on hardware and magnetic drives. What geographies? Very important. There was a time when the Europeans didn't trust the Americans, and they said that you couldn't send data across from US to Europe. And recently, I think a couple of years back, they started trusting each other. And I'm sure we don't want our data traveling through some of our neighboring countries, right? So what colos do you store your data in, where it can travel, where it cannot travel? What are your compliance logging needs? If you're a healthcare organization, they're going to ask you about HIPAA. Do you need to be BCI compliant? Do you need to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliient? There are certain, if you're providing a mission-critical kind of applications, there is a new thing. There's a thing called ISO 27001. Do you need that kind of compliance? We had somebody talk about SAS 70 audit reports in one of the earlier sessions. Some of those questions you need to ask what your compliance logging needs are. SSO identity management. So a lot of us, when we started having phones because we're not used to the password, set our passwords. I know I had 1234 for some time as my login password, but then my company forced me and enforced a policy, and now I have a more stronger password. But that's another thing where you're talking about how your identities get created, what's the passwording policies that are there, what kind of SSO have you put in, because the minute that you get into the cloud, you're going to have public, private, SaaS providers. What kind of SSO credentials do you have? But in certain cases, you won't be allowed to send your enterprise credential. The example that we heard a short while back was I don't know how many of you attended that session, but where he was saying that the encryption key that you have should be available only to you, not to the provider. Similarly with your passwords too. You have a mix of physical, virtual, and cloud. Even if you've got a mixed set, which is a hybrid or a partnering kind of solution, there are companies which will either allow you to have always that mix. You might have certain things you want to run on physical. Even people like Amazon, actually, if you pay a little more, can let you run some jobs on actually physical boxes, not always VM. What kind of mix do you have? Who pays for security? We heard the monetization sessions a short while back. Who's giving you the money when a breach occurs? Who's giving you money for buying the security? What kind of agreements do you have? Who's accountable for what piece of security? I'm assuming all of you are here so you know what security aspects the SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS have. In certain cases, in SaaS, you would be possibly the provider would be a lot less responsible for your security needs as compared to an IaaS, and that's the stack that you have. How do you react if a breach takes place? Your child gets lost. What do? You go to the police. You get really worried. What do you do in this case? What happens when there's a denial of service? What is your ability to deal with it from a PR perspective, from a technology perspective? You have a rogue administrator who threatens to wipe out all your data, encrypted or not, because he's been fired or she's been fired. Well, can you deal with that situation? That's some of the things. It's a reasonably busy picture, but kind of to tell you about the network. So we've got a lot of these enterprises. We have the private cloud and the public cloud, and you're going to be ending up as a mix of all three, depending on what your needs are. You heard about Office 365, which is probably sitting a lot in the upper part. You could have banks who may say, I want only a private cloud, or may say, I just want to be in the enterprise, but still use some cloud-like features. Depending on all three of these, you would have different needs. And the most important entry point for that is the one on the top, which is the multi-device access. These days, access is usually 4 screens, right? I think Sanjeev was talking about 3 screens. It's probably 4 screens. It's desktop, tablet, smartphone, feature phone. We often don't think of the 4th one, but there are a lot of data-enabled feature phones that are there, especially in the emerging markets. That's the 4 screens. So first thing you want to think about, how do you enforce policies, security, because all of these are connecting to your cloud. First, strong authentication. We'll talk a little bit about that, but fundamentally, if you go outside and talk to one of those booths, they've got this OTP strong authentication they're talking about. There are a lot of those use cases that you might want to use if you're considering cloud security. Geopolitical considerations we talked about, because who's accessing what from where, and who do you not want accessing. That's one more part. As you get into the access, you have the first thing you would have is the ingress-egress security, where your proxy is set up, what's your incoming traffic filtering, what's your outgoing traffic filtering, do you need to have whitelists, blacklists? By whitelist, blacklist, what I essentially just mean is like, do you block A, B, C, or do you just say everybody except A, B, C should be allowed? What kind of policies would you set in? Would you set up, say, forward proxies, reverse proxies, stuff like that? Federated SSO. This is important because what is happening a lot is when, especially when you have partner clouds or when you bring in these mixes of different types of clouds, you would have 2 enterprises which might not be related, maybe different companies, but saying that we're going to federate across these 2 networks. Say I trust your credential, you trust mine, and basically build up a federation. In a cloud security concept, it's important for you to understand what kind of federation you're going to set up and the tunnels that set up along with that. Privileged access. Very, very important in the rogue administrator scenario, which I just talked about. Especially when you're looking at either setting up a private cloud or when you're talking to a public cloud provider who gives it to you, it's very important for you to consider things like delegation. For example, the basics are don't have it as admin, of course, but we all know that. Well, some of us might still have it, but and second is these passwords get shared by different people, so how do you know who's using what? So when you talk of privileged user management, there's certain concepts like delegation. There are certain concepts like who checks out passwords and when. So again, when you have the provider, these are some of the things that you would need to check out in terms of how privileged credentials are getting managed. coming back here, we talk a little bit about the physical, virtual, and cloud part of resources. So obviously, there's a mix of all three kinds, or how are your security policies that are going to be applied across the three of them. You're very used to doing it on your desktops. Are you appropriately doing it for your VMs? For example, if you talk of APIs on VMs, so if you heard, there are something called as VM-safe APIs, if you heard of them. Where do you install your antivirus? Is it running on every VM that runs, or is it running on the base? What's the access policies of when you try to access a VM? Will it go through the base? Will you be one VM be able to access another VM? Some of those things are equally important. And some of us think these are only important on the desktop, but let me tell you, how many of you have an Android phone? Quite a few of you. The way Android phone actually works is you've got VMs running on it, right? You've got the Divik OS, and basically your processors are running on VMs. You've got a corporate box. What theoretically would happen if you had an infected VM, comes back in here and breaches security, you connect your corporate network, well, rest could be history. Where's your VMs? Cloud, physical, virtual, cloud security. Secure data at rest and motion. Somebody was just talking about workloads some time back in terms of how your data moves, where's your data stored, when it's at motion, what kind of access is there. For example, if you've got it stored in a table, there's another problem that happens quite a lot is, especially with a data perspective, a lot of people when you move from a non-cloud to a cloud, maybe you're moving from a relational database into a NoSQL kind of database, or you're moving into, let's say, a key value store kind of a database. When you have these changes, how's the authentication setup? Are you going to have, say, record level authentication? Who has access to those? What are your hashes? All of those become equally important. And data in motion, of course, somebody talked about how the data moves in. Wipeout and encryption. This is not a scenario which you would want, but we all hope that we will stay married all our lives, but divorces happen. So you could theoretically have a divorce with your cloud provider at some point. At that point, what are you going to do? Well, in India, there's not much of a prenup that happens. In US, it does. Or in many other parts of the world, it does. In India, there's not much. But in this case, it's like your child at school. So you have to have ways and means of doing wipeouts. How do you trust? We all know our BlackBerries get wiped out when we type in 6 times or 8 times the wrong password. And we all know that there are ways that you could remotely wipe out data. But do you really think that is enough? There are recovery tools which can get your data back, even on the boxes where you had stored your data in the cloud. Would you go to the extent of asking for a DGOS of that box? I don't know. That's something you should look at when you set up these things. The other thing, of course, on those boxes are sometimes you would store keys. When do you shred your keys? When do you leave your keys? Where are your keys moving across box to box are questions that you should ask for. Because in many of these cases, these are not in your control. They're the stuff you've given to the provider across this stack. Logging, auditing, compliance. We kind of talked about that a little bit. Playback is the other thing that I haven't talked about, which is another part of privileged user management, which is now when you do the audit, there is another thing that sometimes is there. Logs are like huge pages. So in a cloud kind of scenario, there's another interesting thing that you could ask for if they have an appropriate, which is called as a playback. In certain cases, it could even be a video playback where they can even show you what are the commands that are entered, and in what sequence, and who is doing it. That's another interesting thing that you could consider in order to gain compliance information or logging information. Multi-tenancy, again, if you walk down to one of those booths out there, there are those, or I don't remember, there's one of the booths or one of the sessions that I saw, where they're talking about these vertical stacks of data isolation. I think it's at one of the booths, the booth you just walk by here. Vertical stacks of data isolation where they're assuring you that your data is not multi-tenant if you want to be. So there are those kinds of storage solutions that you should consider if you need, in terms of saying that if you're absolutely not comfortable with multi-tenancy, maybe with certain things that you are comfortable with multi-tenancy, certain things you aren't. And there's a solution that you should talk about in terms of multi-tenancy. Secure data and backup. This is, again, as we talked about, really important because Often in a cloud kind of data, as we saw in big data, somebody was giving the example of Google CEO talking about enormous amounts of data being generated every day in the mobile and the network, or even otherwise. You're often going to have multi-levels of data because there are going to be regulatory compliances which may need you to store certain types of data for 7 years, 6 years, 7 years. And those are probably going to be at the back end of your data store because those are primarily store once, read if ever. But you're going to have multiple levels, which may be, say, in a pure database terminology, maybe it's linked through hashes and some of those things. So what you would need to do is, if that last bit is stored, sometimes it could be even stored in a warehouse, which is at a third party, which could need to be safe. And some of the other ones might be more closer to where your action is, where there's more reads and writes going on. In that case, there's not much more. So securing data in your backup is really important. One other thing that people don't often tend to talk about, but because we assume it, is actually physical security. Because you're dealing now with anybody who provides a service, especially in cloud security, because you're assuming that the service level agreement says that physical security is guaranteed. But it is important that not always is it a case of a data and object getting lost. There was somebody talking about one object getting lost in 10,000 objects, and we were worried about that. But what if somebody just walks away with your box? The assumption, of course, is that it is backed up, co-located. It is not co-located, it's backed up right across. But physical security is another aspect that you should consider about, because in other cases you were doing it yourself, here you're doing it across the network. Multi-devices, the first thing that I believe is the mobile is an extension of the cloud. You should look at it like that, enforce the right policies. Secure mobile apps on the cloud. Now this is a completely new dimension, right? If you've got iPhone and Android, say for example, you're just uploading apps. One of the key differences, for example, could be that the Android apps could be, theoretically, anybody can host an Android app, right? Whereas iPhone is only through Apple Store. And we talked a lot about BYOD. We love downloading apps. Maybe your son, we heard somebody say that a CFO wants the tablet in the organization because his son wants to play games with it, or something like that, an hour back. So you have all these scenarios where people are bringing these downloads of potentially untrusted sources into your cloud environment, corporate or non-corporate. And that is where you need to make sure that you set certain policies. You may not always be able to set up policies to say, like the self-serve tool we saw of applications, people may just download their own stuff because it's maybe a BYOD. On-cloud, on-device virus scanning. How many of us know what antivirus we're running on our mobile? Anybody? We actually have somebody back there who knows that. What are you running? Okay, great. So most of us don't know, but I hope we're running one. And I can see a few smiles. I hope your phone is running one. So that's the other thing, on-cloud, on-device scanning. Seamless policies for mobile devices, the identity management policies, the security policies that we talked about from the processes part, which with the person Microsoft was talking about in terms of security. He had the data security and the process security. The processes part, do you have those policies coming right across? Credential lifecycle management. We look at credential lifecycle management very strongly in our desktop world, enterprise world, but do we necessarily go ahead and do the same on say the mobile world? When a person leaves the company, of course you take the device away, but is there any other way that you make sure that those credentials are appropriately revoked, the policy revoked? What if it was his own phone? You don't take his phone back, right? You want to make sure you revoke all the corporate rights, but he's going to keep his phone. So what do you do for creation, deletion, archiving? Maybe you reuse the credential later. How do you deal with those scenarios? Because they're all linked with your cloud infrastructure. Secure roaming users, again, not something we are used to we're used to workloads moving around in the cloud, but the minute you bring in mobile and the four-screen experiences, you have roaming users connecting to various networks, connecting to various parts of your and others' networks. So basically, you've got to secure them. Multi-factor authentication. Using OTPs and SMS-based authentication. Here I've taken 2 examples, but as I was saying, you could see another example in the booth. There's this thing called as a gold key and iron key, which is there essentially. What it allows you to do, take a device, it stores certain credentials which you could store, encrypt your box which is there, and call it secure. The other thing, of course, is that what we were talking about, the public-private key kind of thing, where it's an encrypted key, you put it on the cloud and nobody can access it. AWS, the Amazon gives you something called as Amazon multi-factor authentication, and obviously that's an option you could use. Gemalto gives you smart cards, and there are lots of other vendors which are there. Two-factor authentication using SMS. This is useful in certain cases of devices. There are certain companies which allow you to enable this through APIs. And if you don't have access to, say, you don't want to do a costly device-based authentication, or you don't want to use virtual tokens, you could use SMS as a medium to do a second factor of authentication. Okay, so in conclusion, cloud security is critical to succeed. That's interesting. Cloud security is critical to succeed in the cloud. Well, it seems repetitive, but I missed that. Choose private, public, hybrid clouds appropriately, whether you use SaaS, PaaS, whichever means. Identity privileged user management, whether it's from your own enterprise to the hybrid clouds, to the public clouds, make sure you understand that. Compliance, certification, and logging. We talked of standards. Make sure you've done that right. Consider multi-device scenarios. In fact, the PC is probably declining, so your other one might be the more dominant factor in a few years. Use strong authentication. And we come back where we started. Okay, so here's my belief. Like, you've all spent 2 days here. It's the second part of the day, of the second day, and you've probably heard a lot of stuff. It's the afternoon. Well, research probably says you'll retain about 10% of what I'm saying, and then look up the slides, if I'm lucky. The rest of you will move on. So, but I'm reasonably sure that you will not forget your child or that favorite child whom you want. You will not forget the questions you asked before you put him on that bus to go to school. You will want him to grow up. So remember those questions that you asked. You will not forget your spouse's anniversary party that you planned, and you will not want to look bad in one of your friends. You will not want to miss out on a flight from going to point A to point B. Maybe some airlines recently aren't taking you from point A to point B, but okay, I think we all know which airlines. I don't want certain local people, owners of airlines beating me up, so I will not take names. So yeah, we all want to go from point A to point B securely, be rescued if our plane crashes. We all will continue to keep our money in the bank and not dig holes. So just remember the questions that you asked when you did these 4. And if you simply remember those scenarios, I'm reasonably sure that you'll know what to do when you're faced with a scenario where you will have to make a decision on cloud security or cloud computing. So thus, I believe that the cloud is really as secure as you want it to be. Thank you.